Hi, this is Tom Morris at Fullerton College, and this is a video meant for my environmental biology lab students. And in this video, I want to introduce the week's activity, which is analysis of community distribution at Upper Newport Bay. This is a document you're going to need to download from the lab page on Canvas. And let me go over just what's going to be happening on what we're going to be doing with this activity. The whole point of the activity is to try to figure out why we're seeing the distribution that we are seeing in terms of communities, ecological communities at Upper Newport Bay. To give you sort of a preview of what you can be expecting. Ultimately, everything's going to boil down to 8 questions on the last page of this document, so it's going to be nice for you to have this document printed out so you can jot down some responses. These questions you're not going to turn in to me, but where you're going to use them as a basis for answering questions on an online quiz. So you're going to want to have some idea about how you can respond, because these are difficult questions. I mean, some of them are real simple, like this one's worth 1 point, but several of the questions are a little bit more involved, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit later on. So the idea here is that you want to get prepped for an online quiz that you're going to be needing to take on this activity. And I'll go over this document a little bit more a little bit later on. Let's do kind of a review of Upper Newport Bay and kind of what I walked you through on that little travelogue on ecological communities last time. So this is the bay. This is the area that I'm showing here is the area that we mapped out last time. We started, let's zoom in here just a tad. We started at this little point here, Vista Point, which is at the intersection of East Bluff Drive and Back Bay Drive in Newport Beach. And I stood up here and pointed out some of the different communities. So here I can see really quickly riparian woodland, some stands of tall grasses, which is a freshwater marsh, and then some salt barren here. We mapped that out. And then I walked down this road, stopped at a few places, and we went over property sheets. And in the property sheets, we indicated the different attributes, physical attributes of these ecological communities. In particular, the groundwater content, the saltiness of the soil, and the oxygen content of the soil, among other things. So we continue walking and mapped out. Here's more salt barren. We encountered freshwater marsh along the road here. Talked a little bit about freshwater marsh, and then continued on around the bend, and finally at this point. So that was the basic the basic operations of the last activity. But what I'd like to do is go through you just a little bit more detailed review of each of the 4 communities in preparation for today's activity. Here is a map showing the riparian woodland, the distribution of the riparian woodland, as you can see here. And the riparian woodland in this area of the bay is pretty much isolated to this one spot. You can see from this picture that the riparian woodland is primarily was basically made up of it was a dense stand of trees to about 30 feet tall, along with some tall shrubs that accompanied. The physical characteristics, very briefly, the groundwater availability was good, except that the groundwater is about 10 feet deep. So you needed to have pretty deep roots to get at that groundwater in general. Oxygen content of the riparian woodland, oxygen content was high and the salt content was low. Here is an aerial view of the salt barren. The salt barren, you can see, is quite large, and it was, if you take a look at this image, you can see that it's made up of a dense carpet of very short plants, and the oxygen content in the salt barren in terms of physical characteristics, oxygen content in the soil in the salt barren was high, but also so was the salt. So salt content in the salt barren was extremely high, and then moisture content in the soil, the water availability, and in the salt barren was very low. It's typically dry. This is a map or aerial photo showing the distribution of the freshwater marsh, and we saw it in several places in little pockets here and there. The freshwater marsh is made out. The freshwater marsh is populated mainly by tall grasses. Here is a picture of cattails, and there's also sedges. And the interesting feature with about cattails and sedges, especially the sedges, is that they tend to have hollow stems, and the hollow stems can be very, very helpful in absorbing oxygen from the air, and that's important, as you'll read about in today's activity. The physical properties of the freshwater marsh is the water content is high. In fact, it's so high that the soil is saturated and submerged. The soil is submerged under maybe 6 inches of fresh water. Salt content is very, very low, and so is the oxygen content in the soil. Here's an aerial shot of the salt marsh. You can see the salt marsh is quite large. It spans large tracts of land in the Upper Bay. The salt marsh is composed primarily of cord grass, which is another hollow-stemmed plant. Tends to be about maybe 2 to 3 feet tall at the tallest. The physical characteristics of the salt marsh were it was the only community that experienced daily tidal flushing, so it would be flushed out depending on the height of the high tide. It could be flushed out with seawater twice a day, 2 high tides a day, 2 low tides a day. At any rate, the soil moisture is very, very high, and sometimes submerged under several inches or several feet of seawater. The oxygen content is very, very low, so 0 oxygen in the soil of the salt marsh. And then the salt content was moderate. It's equivalent to that of seawater, which is about 3.4%. So that's a quick review of the 4 ecological communities that I went over in the last activity with you. And I do recommend that you maybe pull out the paper from that last activity where you have hopefully had written notes, because that is going to be very, very helpful for you for doing today's activity. So the question is, why do we have this distribution? And so that's the point of this today's activity, is to do some analysis to try to get close to an understanding of why the plants in this part of the bay are distributed the way that they are. So let's take a look at the activity itself and some of the features in here. So I mentioned, let me go back down here to the questions. I'm going to be asking you to write responses to these questions in preparation. So this is practice for you for the quiz, to write responses down to these questions. But let me go over the questions because they do make references to resources in this document. So, for example, question 1 says, what's one physical environmental circumstance that prevents trees from living in the area occupied by the freshwater marsh? And then it refers to Table 1. And I'm going to talk with you about Table 1. Next question is more detailed, refers to Table 2. So let's start with Table 1. So here is Table 1. Oh yeah, okay, I'm wondering, where's the heading for this? There's the heading, Table 1. Okay, so, and what Table 1 does is it talks about, as I say here, environmental sensitivities to the physical environment for certain types of plants and traits and stuff. So I'm going to go through these quickly with you. You're going to need to spend more time on your own on these. For each of the categories, I talk about groundwater, soil salt, light, and then some traits. So for trees, trees need to have their roots in moist groundwater all year long. They need to have, for trees, they need to have their, as I mentioned, they need to have access to groundwater all year round. They're not drought tolerant. Generally, trees are not drought tolerant. They also need to have abundant oxygen in the soil. Remember, oxygen supports certain biological activities. You're going to read about those. We talked about those before in a previous activity. And then they also do best when there's very, very low amounts of salt in the soil. As far as light goes, trees need to have access to abundant direct sunlight. And so let's talk really quickly about some of the traits they have. They have deep, broad root systems that allow them to get access to deep groundwater and mineral nutrients and molecular oxygen. They also grow tall. So they're able to get up high so they can get access to sunlight. And they're, as I mentioned before, they're not drought tolerant. So if there is a place where there's a shortage of soil moisture, then trees won't do well there. Let's go quickly and talk about saltgrass. So saltgrass and pickleweed, we found those in the salt barren. They can do okay if there's not much groundwater. So they are drought tolerant. But they do still require high amounts of oxygen in the soil. But they can also deal with high amounts of soil salt. Okay, even though they would do, as I mentioned here, they do fine in low salt soils. They don't need high amounts of soil or salt in the soil. But if there's high amounts of salt in the soil, they're able to tolerate it. But they also need access to sunlight, and this can be a problem because these are short little plants. They're only, saltgrass is only a few inches high, and pickleweed may be only maybe a foot high, something like that at the most. So if they are in an area with taller shrubs or tall trees, those trees are going to block them out, and these plants aren't going to do well because they're not going to get direct access to the sun. So traits that saltgrass and pickleweed have is they're able to tolerate salty soils. Saltgrass has a way of excreting the salt, and pickleweed has a way of diverting and shunting the salt away, and so they're able to cope with those, with high salt in the soil. Let's talk about cattails for a moment. Cattails and sedgegrass are marsh plants. That's where we find them. We might find them in places where there is abundant groundwater and it's non-salty, but it's constantly available near the surface of the soil. So these plants really thrive. They do best when they're kind of in soil that is submerged under several inches of fresh water. They don't have deep roots, so as the water is near the surface, then that's when they do best. Now, here's something interesting as far as soil oxygen. they would do well if there was a high amount of oxygen in the soil, but they can still persist in places that have little or no oxygen, which is kind of interesting how that happens. We'll talk about that in just a second. As far as soil salt, they do best when they're in low salt soils, and they really can't tolerate much salt at all. So they're kind of restricted to freshwater environments. Light, like all plants, they do best if they have direct access to sunlight. They grow maybe 10 feet tall. The cattails can be about 10 feet tall. Sedges maybe 6 feet tops. So if they're in an environment with taller plants that they can be shaded out, and they would not do well there. Traits: cattails and sedge grasses have air-filled hollow tubes. So just showed a picture of that before, and we talked about that in the previous activity. And the hollow tubes can be very, very useful. So moving on to cordgrass. Now cordgrass is we found cordgrass in the salt marsh. So they're very similar to the freshwater marsh grasses, like cattails and sedges were in the freshwater marsh. Cordgrass, being a marsh grass, it really does best when there is superabundance of moisture on the soil or near the soil or right at the soil surface, as I should say, at the soil surface. Especially if they do find if the soil is submerged under several inches of water, or even a foot or more of water, they can do fine. They are not drought tolerant, so you're probably not going to find cordgrass in places where the soil is dry or where the groundwater is too deep. They just don't have a way of coping with that. Soil O2, same thing as with the cattails and the sedges from the freshwater marsh. The cordgrass can do fine if there's high amounts of oxygen, but if there's no oxygen in the soil, which is the case in the salt marsh, they can still survive. Soil salt, cordgrass can do fine in places where the salts in the soil are low, but they can also do well when there's a moderate amount of salts in the soil, like in the salt marsh. But they're not tolerant at all to very high amounts of salt. So if you have very high amounts of salt, then they're not going to do well. Light, just like everything else, these plants grow to maybe 3 feet tall. So if they're in an environment where they are shaded out by other tall plants, then that's going to be a problem for them. So cordgrass is they have high tolerance for changes in the soil and water salinity. That's the saltiness of the soil, but they do best with there's low amounts of salt, as I mentioned before, or moderate amounts of salt, like as in the salt barren. And then they have hollow-filled tubes in their stems, like we saw with the cattails and the sedge grasses from the freshwater marsh. So that kind of gives you a brief survey of the various the different plants in the different communities. I want to talk with you now about Table 2 and give you the context for that. So in the first question, I asked you a simple question: what's one physical environmental circumstance that prevents trees, ... and then consult Table 2. Consult Table 1. So I just went over that with you. Second question, or the follow-up question, is, and by the way, since I'm here, let me talk on this page. I have this little note here: too much, too little. So that's the kind of the way that I'd prefer to have you respond to this question. So What's one physical environmental circumstance that prevents trees from living in the area occupied by the freshwater marsh? And basically you could say because there's too much blah, blah, something, 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 some physical environmental circumstance. Physical environmental circumstance refers to oxygen content in the soil, salt content in the soil, moisture content in the soil, access to sunlight. All of the kind of features that we just got through talking about on table 1. So there's too much, for example, there's too much light, or there's too little light, or there's too much salt, or there's too little salt, or there's too much water in the soil, or there's too little water in the soil, there's too much oxygen in the soil, there's too little oxygen in the soil, those types of statements. So now the follow-up question, so let's go to table 2, says, well, what's the biological reason that this physical circumstance prevents trees from occupying the area? So now this one's a little bit more involved, because what I want from you here is so it's going to be multiple steps. The circumstance from question 1 triggers some biological feature, which then triggers results in another consequence, which in turn results in an additional consequence, which eventually results in death. So on these questions, I'm looking for a series of steps. I want you to provide a series of steps that this causes this to happen, and when that happens, then this happens, and then when that happens, then this happens, and then when that happens, cell operations come to a halt and the plant dies. That kind of a thing. So, question 2 and 4 and 6 are these types of multiple stage sort of cascading answers type questions. So let's look at table 2. All right. And I'm not going to go, I'm just going to go over this really, really quickly with you. Okay. So the, I talk about various aspects, physical aspects, groundwater, access to groundwater, molecular oxygen, salt in the soil, and space and light. Okay, so the key feature, and you're going to need to read this, but let me highlight some of the key features here. So here is groundwater. And the thing is that in some of the cases, groundwater is going to be in short supply. So let me mark some places for you to look. If the groundwater is in short supply, then this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens. So I want you to pay attention to that, because in some places in the bay, the groundwater is in short supply, or there is something that happens to the ability to get access to that groundwater that makes it in short supply. And so I'd like for you to pay attention to that. Molecular oxygen. So molecular oxygen is consumed by all the plant's living cells at all times, okay? And it's used to support cellular respiration, okay? And if you can't perform cellular respiration, then there are consequences. So if O2 is in short supply, then bloomp, 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 bloomp. These things happen. All right, kind of getting the idea. All right, let's look at salt in the soil. All right, so what salt does is salt tends to draw water towards it. And what that means is that salt, because the salts in the soil pull water out of the plant. And that results in the cells in the plant losing water, and that causes some consequences that you can read here. And then let's talk about space really quickly. And again, I'm just hitting some of the highlights on this table. You're going to spend a little bit of time going back to it, I hope. So the deal with space is that space allows for plants to spread out and access the sun. It allows for them to put down roots and get nutrients from the soil, and molecular oxygen from the soil, and water from the soil. But there are consequences if space is in short supply. Okay, if space is in short supply, so in other words, if you're a little plant, you're being crowded out by nearby gigantic plants, then that's going to be a problem, and that's what I'm talking about here. Right, so that's space. And then light. So light is obviously is a form of electromagnetic energy. Yeah. So light is consumed in the process of photosynthesis. And remember, photosynthesis makes chains of fixed carbon, which also then provides the basis for making larger biological molecules of the plant, like sugars, DNA, proteins, cell membranes, carbohydrates, cellulose, that sort of stuff. So if light is in short supply, okay, then photosynthesis is reduced and blah, blah, blah. So then this happens, and that happens, and this happens, and that happens. Okay, so you kind of get the idea. So this is the table. This is table 2. This is the table you really need to consult for coming up with questions to help you answer the questions 2, 4, and 6. All right, and so these are 4-point questions. So your responses need to be reflective of the detail that I'm showing you in table 2. Okay. So I want to go through this. This seems to be a lot. So I do want to want you to again pull out the activity packet for the first visit to Upper Newport Bay. Hopefully you made notes on that, and that can be really, really helpful for you completing these questions. So to help you kind of get organized, I provided a little checklist, and so I want to go over this checklist with you. So if you have, hopefully you have this document printed out, and you can kind of follow along with me, and I'm going to quickly go through it with you so that you can use it to sort of get your mind organized about the differences between these different ecological communities. So let me go through, let me get started on this. All right, so on the checklist I have got several categories: groundwater, soil O2, soil salt, height needed in order to get access to the direct sun, and whether or not the physical environment is exclusionary, and I'll talk about that in a second. So let's go through riparian woodland checklist. Remember the plants in the riparian woodland were trees up to 30 feet tall, and very different species of trees we talked about, and then tall shrubs. The groundwater for the riparian woodland is abundant but deep. The soil O2 was high, but the soil salt was very low. Height needed in order to get access to the direct sun. Well, you needed to be pretty tall. The trees there were like 20, 30 feet tall. So if you're going to live, if you're a plant living in the riparian woodland, it helps if you're tall. I mean, you might be able to have the optimum height would be above 20 feet. Now, excluded by the physical environment. What that means is, like I say here, if we removed all of the plants and just scraped it completely, and you just had bare earth in this location, would plants from other communities be able to live there? Right? Now that there's no biological competition, could we plant salt-bearing plants like pickleweed and saltgrass? Could we plant them there, or would they be excluded? Would they die? And that's what this is asking. So that's what I'm asking for. Excluded by the physical environment. Salt-bearing plants would not be excluded. The pickleweed and saltgrass would do well. They're accustomed to living in soils. They can do well in low-salt soils. They can also do well, even though the groundwater is deep. Salt-bearing plants would still be able to cope with that dryness because they're drought-tolerant. Freshwater marsh plants would be excluded, as well as salt marsh plants. They'd be excluded because the groundwater is too deep for them. All right, so let's move on to next category, which is the salt barren. And so now the salt barren was populated by saltgrass and pickleweed. So you remember the salt barren? These plants it was like a dense carpet of short plants. And so let's go over the physical sort of characteristics here. The groundwater was scarce, generally dry. Soil O2, however, was high. There was plenty of oxygen in the soil, but so was there high amounts of salt in the soil. Height needed in order to get access to unshaded light, that is, you're not going to be shaded out, then you don't have to be super tall. There's not a bunch of tall plants covering you and shading you out. So excluded by the physical environment, so the riparian woodland plants would be excluded because for two reasons. It's too dry and it's too salty. So the trees wouldn't be able to, and shrubs wouldn't be able to live here. Freshwater marsh plants also would be excluded because it's too dry and also too salty. And the same for the salt marsh plants. They would be excluded for the same reason. It's too dry, and even for the salt marsh plants, it's too salty. Salt marsh plants can do fine in areas that have low and moderate amounts of salt, but there is a limit, and the cordgrass would not be able to live in this soil, which has extreme salt. So let's go to the freshwater marsh and do a checklist there. So the freshwater marsh was populated by sedge grass and cattails. These are those tall grasses that have hollow stems in them. So the freshwater marsh has abundant groundwater near the surface, but it has no oxygen in the soil. So there's no oxygen in the soil. The soil salt is very, very low in the freshwater marsh. It's low because that region is flushed out by fresh water that slowly moves through that area. So it washes out any of the salts that might come in there by occasional high tides. So low salt in the soil. Height needed in order to get access to the sun. Probably need to be 10 feet or higher because cattails can grow 10 feet or taller. So that would be about the right range. Excluded by the physical environment. So would salt-bearing plants be excluded if we removed all of the sedge grass and cattail grass from the freshwater marsh area and we planted pickleweed and saltgrass? Would they be able to survive there, or would they be excluded? And the answer is salt-bearing plants would be excluded because for two reasons. Well, the main reason is that there's low oxygen content in the soil. Same for riparian plants. They would be excluded because there's no oxygen in the soil. However, the salt marsh plants would do fine in the freshwater marsh. So salt marsh plants, the cordgrass, they can tolerate the salty, the seawater, but they don't need salty soils. So if you cleared out that freshwater marsh area and just put in, then planted salt marsh plants, the cordgrass, they would do fine. So let's move to the salt marsh checklist. So the salt marsh was populated by cordgrass, which is a little 3-foot tall grass that lives in the salt marsh. So let's go through that. The groundwater is abundant and near the surface, similar to the freshwater marsh. The soil O2 is 0. Soil salt for the salt marsh is moderate because it gets high tides that bring in seawater and flood the area. Height needed in order to get access to the sun, probably 3 feet. The cordgrass doesn't grow that tall. And what would be the plants that would be excluded? So if we scraped away all of the cordgrass and just left the bare soil, which of these plants would be excluded? Well, the salt-bearing plants would be excluded because of the lack of oxygen in the soil. The freshwater marsh plants, the cattails and the sedge grasses, would be excluded because it's too salty in the soil. And then riparian plants would be excluded because there's no oxygen in the soil and because the soil is too salty. So that gives you sort of an idea of kind of how to approach this this activity. It's going to be helpful for you to do some review from the previous activity we did at Upper Newport Bay. Consult your notes and then read consult the information in Table 1 and consult the information in Table 2 and jot down these are like quiz prep questions from the Draw a Tree activity. So get yourself ready, jot down answers, make sure you're responding, not just copying and pasting, okay? But make sure you're responding to the question, that you provide answers to these, too much or too little, and for questions 1, 3, and 5, and then a cascade of responses. If this happens, then that causes that to happen, then that causes, I've already gone over that with you. So make sure your responses have several nodes, 3 or 4 nodes on them for questions 2, 4, and 6. And then questions 7 and 8 talk about traits. So you will consult Table 1 for each of those and then jot down short little answers in response to that. And then take the online quiz. You can consult these notes, take the online quiz, which will be a short answer. And good luck. If you have questions, as always, then please message me using the inbox feature in Canvas.